your chance to talk. Repeat that questioners won't be filmed, so you can feel free to talk.
Sir, I was just wondering if you believe that the United States of America has a responsibility to intervene in cases where just war says that it is justified to intervene.
Do I think that there's a responsibility to intervene in cases where just war theory concludes that it is correct to intervene? Is that the question? Personally, I agree with the UN Charter, the high-level UN panel of December 2004 and the UN World Summit, which I quoted. But I can't really answer the question because as far as I can determine, you can tell me if I'm wrong, just war theory never tells you anything. It doesn't tell you when it's proper to intervene. What it tells you is, I think it's proper to intervene. Well, you know, I may also think so, but there's a big gap between assertion and argument, and between surmise and evidence. So if you can tell me where just war theory entails that we ought to intervene, we can consider the question. But until that's done, we can't really consider the question.
Sir, I was wondering.
Sorry, I don't.
Right here, sir.
Oh.
I was wondering, do you believe that it would have been right to reassess Article 51 of the UN Charter, and do you believe that by not reassessing it and not rewriting it, it loses relevancy?
I'm sorry, I didn't get it. Could you say it again?
By not reassessing it and not rewriting it,
yeah.
Do you believe it loses its...
Well, it has been reassessed repeatedly. For example, by the high-level UN panel of December that issued its report on 2004 with many distinguished participants. I mentioned Brent Scowcroft, but there are others. Yes, that's exactly what they did. They reassessed the UN Charter, and their conclusion is what I read. The UN World Summit last September again reassessed the UN Charter, and that's what it concluded. Maybe there should be a further reassessment. Fine, then let's undertake it. And let's consider their arguments or other arguments. But we can't say that it hasn't been reassessed. I mean, we can say that we haven't paid any attention to it. Well, that's possible, in fact, true. But it certainly has been reassessed by very respectable and leading figures. And their conclusions, in my opinion at least, are pretty justified. However, to get back to the main topic, I don't think just war theory tells us anything about that. When we judge these things, we're judging them on another basis, on the basis of actual evidence about what happens in particular cases, in terms of our fundamental moral principles, which we should try to explicate and apply, like the principle of universality. That's the way we should reassess it. Also, we should, I think seriously about the statement that I quoted of the December 2004 panel that was directed to people like us. It was directed to intellectual opinion in the West. And can read it again, but what they said is the foundations of world order based on the principle of non-intervention in the affairs of others, not forceful intervention, is too important and too fragile to be destroyed, or the consequences will be terrible, because for one to act is to grant the authority to all, at least if we believe in elementary moral principles. That's a heavy burden to bear. Maybe we could come up with a different conclusion in some cases. Actually, personally, I think we can, but it has to be argued.
Sir, Cadet Greco, you said that it's possible that Article 51 needs to be reassessed. But you mentioned earlier when you were referencing Walter's book that he said that the Israeli preemptive strike was justified. You also stated that his arguments did not really have justification by his theory. However, in the case of the preemptive strike, he does say that there are several criterion that are necessary for the Israeli attack to be justified, specifically the fact that the Egyptian army was standing at a state of readiness that the Israeli army was incapable of holding. So, under Article 51, even though Egypt had not yet invaded Israel, that they were not at war. However, what Egypt was doing tactically put Israel at a severe disadvantage. So, under our modern definition of war, it seems to me that ought to be, it seems to me, it seems logical that it ought to be called an act of war, what Egypt was doing, putting Israel at such a disadvantage. So doesn't Article 51 definitely need some reassessment?
Well, Article 51 clearly does not apply. I read Article. We can argue that it was justified, but we can't say that Article 51 justifies it. Not under Daniel Webster's characterization or any other one that's accepted by the international community. We might argue, and here's where I think you could make an argument, that if you consider the range of issues that arose at the time, the preemptive strike was justified. Maybe one can give such an argument. But the point is that no argument is given to that effect. None of the relevant facts are considered, and this is regarded as one of the half-dozen cases where a just war theory entails that the use of military force was legitimate. Just war theory doesn't entail that. It doesn't entail anything. What it tells you is, well, I, Michael Walzer, believe this was justified, but without giving any reasons and without looking into the background. If you look into the background, it's a lot more complex than that. There's a lot of literature and scholarship on it. The U.S. didn't have to agree. There were all sorts of possibilities. You could have taken, I don't want to, if you want, I'll run through the background, but it's quite intricate and complex, going back to the question of free passage through the Straits of Tiran and whether that should be brought to the World Court, which the U.S. and Israel refused to do, and Egypt insisted on. Involves Israeli strikes against Syrian targets, all sorts of things. So yes, there's a complicated background. You could look at them. You could decide maybe that in the light of these complex circumstances, perhaps Israel was entitled to make a preemptive strike. But that's not what's claimed. What's claimed is that without looking at any evidence, just war theory, whatever it is, and it's not easy to determine, just war theory entails that this is one of the half-dozen cases in the last century in which the use of force was no doubt legitimate, and the only case in which preemptive strike was legitimate. But we can also raise the question of universality. I don't believe, and I'm sure you don't believe, that Iran has a right to, say, carry out terrorist acts in the United States right now. But undoubtedly it's under serious threat. And undoubtedly the threat is simply overwhelming as compared with Iran's capacities. But it would be outrageous to suggest that, of course. And if it's outrageous to suggest that, why is it legitimate in this case? For one to act is to give the right to all.